And I have to share my screen. That's what I was forgetting. Share more. Okay, hello, welcome back to Bootcamp session number 8. This is actually the final in-person session. That sounds pretty weird to say. There is going to be another asynchronous session that gets released. It's going to be released this Thursday, but it's not going to be on the project, the Bootcamp project, so it's a little bit less urgent, but I do encourage you guys all to watch it as it's going to be over unit testing, and that's something that we're going to do a lot during our actual project teams. So we're going to release that video Thursday, but congrats on making it this far into Bootcamp. So today's agenda, we're going to go over React hooks, which is a more advanced part of React, and then we're all going to go over React router as well. We've seen that a little bit in the project milestone, but a lot of people were asking about it, so we thought we'd cover it in more detail today. And then just a reminder, so today, it's number 8, so we're going over advanced React. And then you can see there's one more unit testing that's going to be asynchronous and released to you guys all. I believe it's going to be on Thursday. And then also at the same time, you guys might have seen messages in Slack that there's a meeting going on with about engineering management, I believe. And that's going on in the other room. And as we all know, these bootcamp sessions are always recorded. So if anybody would rather be at that one and kind of see something a little bit different to bootcamp, you guys can all feel free to go to that, and you can just watch the recorded version of this.
That one will also be recorded though, so if you want to see that recorded, that's also an option.
But sweet, yeah. Does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started with today's content? Sweet. So as always, there's going to be a Kahoot to start out. Final Kahoot. We should have our final prizes, but again, we didn't bring any. Hide floating meeting controls. Escape. It's so janky. More. And as always, feel free to be with the partner too, or just as yourself. And it's slightly too quiet. Huh? I'm so bad at knowing how far away somebody can hear or see things. Oh, it's distracting. Hold on. Is there anything this time?
This will be mostly on last session's Mongoose stuff and CRUD, but there will also be some JavaScript questions at the end.
Oh, and I can turn it up here. Wow, it took this long. Is everybody in, or are we waiting for anybody else? Sweet. So we should be good to get started. Oh, I totally skipped that. I can talk about it. Yeah. So a collection is actually what stores documents. A cluster is kind of where or how your server is stored. So you can have multiple databases as a part of a cluster, and you can have multiple collections in a database, and then you can have multiple documents in a collection. I get that it's kind of some dense terminology and kind of probably not the best named thing, but yeah.
Yeah, nice job. Post is for create operations. So an update, any function that's updating data is always going to require two, because your first input is like finding the document you want to update, and then your second is like what about the document you actually want to update. This is JavaScript.
Nice.
We'll see some more of that syntax later today.
Nice. As we remember, map does not actually modify the values.
It returns a new array.
And then this is our final question, our final bootcamp Kahoot question. What a monument.
30 seconds.
Anybody want to talk about it?
Yeah, so that yellow one is false. Props are available in functional and class components. Props are read-only, that's true. So you can think of props similar to like function input, where like you're taking in the input, but you shouldn't really be modifying that value. Like that's a static value that shouldn't be changed as it's passed into the function.
And then our podium. Well done, Jonathan. Well done, Drew. Well done. Sweet. Sweet.
All right, so before we move on, any questions about the Kahoot stuff we just talked about? All right, awesome. So today we're going to be talking, the first thing we're going to talk about are hooks, and we'll be using hooks to kind of upgrade our functional components in React and kind of give us some new abilities and tools that we didn't have before. So a little bit of review. I know it's been a couple weeks since we actually did like the formal overview of React. I know a lot of people just turned in the milestone. They're still working on the React milestone, so hopefully this is still some fresh content, but just to go over real quick. So we want to remember we have multiple types of components in React, the two being functional and class-based components. So functional components are just basic JavaScript functions, and they're going to return just that JSX syntax that we talked about to display content on our page. And we need a little bit, we need to use hooks to mimic the complex behavior that classes have. We'll talk about what that looks like in a minute, but they're just not as robust right out of the box as class components are. And then class-based components are defined as JavaScript classes, and they can hold multiple functions, other values, things like that, and give us kind of some more complex code we can write using class-based components. And we use a render method to return that JSX syntax that we're going to be displaying on screen. So we've got the syntax examples on the bottom. They're a little bit small, but on the left side, we have that functional component that just returns the single line of JSX, and then the exact same component defined as a class inside the render method returning the JSX. So they'll display the same thing, just written a little bit differently. So now we're going to talk kind of about what hooks are, why we're learning them, and how they're going to help us in our projects. So originally when React first released, class-based components had some functions and features that functional components didn't have. So they allowed developers to do some more complex things that functional components wouldn't allow us to do. So some of these features include really important things such as state and lifecycle methods. We'll talk about both in a lot more detail, but to introduce them a little bit, state's kind of just like what the data currently looks like in a single component. So maybe if our data updates, then our state's going to change in our component, and we might want to change the way that the component looks, we render it, things like that. And similar with lifecycle methods, these are just methods that'll run when the component's at a certain stage in its life. So maybe when it first displays on the screen, when the app first loads, things like that. So originally class-based components did this kind of automatically, and we couldn't do this with functional components, which is why they were originally preferred. But hooks now allow us to use these features in class components. And hooks kind of, when we boil it down, they're just specialized React functions that the React developers have written for us that kind of give us that more advanced functionality that we can use in our function components. So you may be wondering, if these class-based components kind of have this stuff built into it already, why wouldn't we just use the class-based components? Well, to quote the React docs directly, classes confuse both people and machines. They're really not easy to read, a little bit harder to write, and it would be hard for us to kind of teach you all the ins and outs of it in this kind of rush bootcamp format. And it's also just kind of hard to work with on a project team with unintuitive syntax. So class components involve things like function binding and the use of the this keyword to access variables, things like that. We're not going to explain kind of like what all this means because it's not super relevant to the stuff we'll be developing. But it's just important to know that, it's a little bit harder to read than the functional components we'll be writing. And then in addition, classes are a lot larger than functions, and they can kind of slow the load times of our web apps. So this isn't usually a problem that we think about in development when we're in class, maybe writing stuff just for a project. But working on project teams, we're developing for nonprofits. So we do really want to think about kind of efficiency and optimization. And this is just an easy way to solve that problem using functional components instead.
Yeah, so now we're going to go over state, which is like one of the main topics of React. So if you can master props and state, like you have 90% of React learned. There's a lot of other smaller features, but state is big. So state is how we handle changing content on a website. So if you want to type stuff into an input field, or if you want to click a button and have something change, state is kind of how React manages these changes on a web page. So the big thing about state is that it controls when React re-renders. So whenever your state changes, React refreshes. If you're not changing your state, the website is essentially going to be static. And then state is kind of established, and you create a state using the use effect hook or use state hook. By that. So the use state hook. The syntax is a bit funky at first. So if you remember back in the Kahoot when we had that let bracket a comma b equals array 1, 2, 3, the use state hook uses a somewhat similar syntax where it's going to be let and then your state variable and then your set state variable and then equals use state, and then into that use state function you're going to pass the initial value of the state. So let's kind of break that down into what each of those mean. So the state variable, that's going to be, you can treat that kind of like a getter, but it's not a function. So it's going to be a read-only variable similar to props. And you're going to, whenever you want to find out what that state is, you're going to use that variable and just dereference it like a normal JavaScript variable. And then your set state variable, which in this case is set count, that's how you actually change your state. So whenever you're calling set count or any other like state setter, that's what tells React, oh, I need to refresh the page and actually update the content here. And then initial value, that's pretty straightforward. That's just the initial value of state. So in this case, count is initially going to be equal to 0. Yeah, that's pretty much it. State can be any variable type. Any questions so far? This is kind of like a weird topic at first, but it makes more sense as you see more examples.
I'll add here that we'll typically see and call this as like state and set state. Those are not like the names your variables have to be, but they do kind of want to follow that format. So if it's like in the context of our, I guess our project, we could do recipes and then set recipes. Or if it's like a number, count, set count. But we'll say just when talking about these generally, we'll probably reference them as state and then set state.
Yeah, thank you, Cole. So here's like an example of what we would do if we didn't know a state existed and how we'd kind of write a simple web page where you click a button and it adds 1 to like a number on the screen. So on line 2, we can see we initialize this variable called count equals 0, and lines 4 through 6, we define a function that just adds 1 to count. It's pretty straightforward. And then 9 through 12, we have a p tag that shows how many times you click the button. And then on line 11, we have the actual button that adds 1 to count every time we click it. Now, what do you think would happen if I did click the button here? Do you have any guesses, James?
Do the increment count but with regards to the page?
Exactly. So the JavaScript would update, so count would change. But if you actually looked at the web page, nothing's going to change. It's going to be like the button didn't actually notice anything. So that's why we have to use state. So not only is that variable being updated, but it's actually being reflected on the website. So here's like an initial implementation of use state that's still wrong. So we have this now. We have this count state, and then we have set count, and then we're setting it initially to 0. Now, who can tell me why this is wrong? Notice that there's a variable that we created that's not getting used. Yeah, I think I heard it somewhere. So we're not actually using set count. So count is a read-only variable. So when we say count equals count plus 1, like we're not actually telling React to re-render. You need to call set count in order to actually tell React, hey, I updated this variable. Let's actually refresh the page and adjust the value of count. So now we actually have a correct implementation. On line 2, we're creating state, and then in the add 1 function, we're now using set count and just setting count to be count plus 1. So just make sure that whenever you're using state, you're always using the set function in order to change that state. And in that structure, also note that use state should always go at like the top of your like component. So your like state hook, your use state hook should always be like the top thing right inside the component. And then just a couple syntax notes. Use state is a function that React provides, but we actually need to import it. So if you're using an IDE, most of the time it will autofill, but just make sure if use state isn't working, you probably need to import it. As I just said, use state should go at like the top of the component. So it's inside the component, but you're not like putting it in the return because it's not actually HTML. The typical naming scheme, as Cole mentioned, it's state and then set state. So whatever your variable name is, and then set variable. And then finally, this is where it gets kind of tricky, is when you're using when you're using like nested data, like an array or an object, remember that you can't like modify values within that nested thing. So if I have an array of ingredients, I can't just change the ingredients. I actually need to use set state. And usually the best practice is to like copy the existing state, modify it, and then use set state in order to basically use that copy and push it into like the new state variable. And the spread operator is a great way to do that. So if you look at that example, don't use like dot push because then you're modifying the array. Use set ingredients, and then those three dots, that's called the spread operator. That's going to copy ingredients into the list, and then you're going to like append apple to the end of that list. So if you get used to that syntax, it makes it a lot easier to update like arrays and objects. And then passing state as a prop. So this is like a problem you'll eventually run into either this project or on your like actual like nonprofit project team. Sometimes if like multiple components need to reference the same state. So like if we have two child components that both need to share a state, but they're both like rendered inside of one component. So like a good example is like if I have a home page and then in one component I have the like add count button, and then like in a completely different component I have the actual display for the count, then I'd want the state to be inside that parent, and then you can just pass the set state into one component and the actual state into the other. So if you're having trouble like communicating between state, like communicating state between components, find like the closest parent that's like rendering both of those. Again, this will make more sense when you actually like run into the issue, and React has some great documentation on passing state as a prop. And then one last thing is, because of state, how React handles state and kind of refreshing and re-rendering, the way it handles form input is a bit different as well. So there's kind of two ways you can handle this. You can either use uncontrolled components or controlled components. React recommends controlled components, but you can also, uncontrolled components are also a good solution. So for uncontrolled components, you're going to use this hook called the use ref hook, and that just kind of tells React, hey, this is like an uncontrolled component. Here's the ref for this. You don't actually need to know like the technical why that happens, but what you do is if you look on that code example on the left, you use the use ref hook, and then you pass ref in as like a prop to the input tag. And now you can just use the ref.current.value, and that will give you the value, and that will always work. And then on the right side, we're actually connecting like our input to a state variable. So if you look on the code example to the right, we have ingredient and set ingredient. And then we're using like the value attribute on the input tag in order to kind of tie that state to the input tag. So the value displayed in input is directly reflected in the state. And then you also need to pass in like an onChange function that just tells React, hey, whenever I type into this box, update the state. So it's a bit more extra work, but you do get some more functionality for it because you are able to like tie it in with state. So use whichever one you want for this project, but just know that they're both good options. And it's really up to you on how you want to implement that.
So I think we're going to be moving on to lifecycle functions now. And as Ben mentioned earlier, what a lifecycle function is it's going to be like a function that you want to happen kind of like at a certain period of time. A good easy to understand like example of that is if you want your code to run whenever like something loads, or like whenever your page is first loaded as well. That would be an example of a lifecycle functions. So in class components, we had access to different functions such as component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. I believe we didn't touch those in Bootcamp, but that's kind of like how class components what we will learn later is going to be the use effect hook. And these were kind of like the previous solution to doing that. So you might see some examples of this in documentation, but if you see component did mount, component will unmount, or component did update, chances are it's probably going to be solved by the use effect hook, which we'll get into a little bit more in a little bit. And then by using the use effect hook, you're actually telling React that you want your component to do something after a certain action happens. And we can define what that action is, and we can also define the components that we want to re-render. And the use effect hook, it does handle code that has side effects, things like data fetching, setting up a description, and manually changing the DOM and React components are all examples of side effects. And then, yeah, the use effect is kind of going to be, we're going to predominantly use it when making Git fetch requests. So right now our data is stored in our database in MongoDB, and we're going to actually want to load that code in whenever somebody first accesses our website. I know in the past we used like just a separate file, a JavaScript file, and stored all of our data like that. But by putting it in the database and then using the use effect hook, we can actually just get like data anytime we want it. And anybody can get it as well. They just need basically access the database. So moving a little bit more into what use effect actually is again, it's just basically code that runs when a certain effect is triggered. In this example, we'll see, I guess I should point to it. There's like the count in the square brackets. And so this code is going to run basically every time the count variable is changed or modified. And it would also, I believe, run whenever the page is first loaded as well. So yeah, if we look at the top, there's code and then dependencies. The dependencies control when the effect is actually triggered. So that's what I was just talking about with the count. If you don't include square brackets at all, it's going to just re-render, I think, anytime any value changes. That's typically going to cause a lot more reloads and could cause some issues down the line. If you have a square brackets with nothing in it, so if we didn't have count in there, it would just load whenever the page renders. That's very useful when we're fetching data. And then if we put a variable in there, typically it's going to be a state variable. And whenever that variable is updated, that's when the code inside that function is going to run. In this example, it's just going to be updating the title of the page. And then using fetch with use effect, and this is kind of going to be how we end up using this, is we can see two different hooks here. We see the use state hook at the top, where we define things like ingredients and set ingredients. And then inside of our use effect hook, this code is going to be ran whenever the page is being accessed. And so whenever this page is being accessed, we're going to have the function, the fetch, I guess, is what we're going to be doing. And if we've seen lines 5 and 6 before, again, remember, this has to be an asynchronous function. It does take time to get the data from the database. That depends a little bit on internet speed and stuff like that. So we're going to want to make sure this is an asynchronous function. And then on line 7 is where we're actually using the use state hook to set the data returned from our database and put that in the variable called ingredients. And again, this is just going to be ran that one time whenever the page is rendered because of the 2 square brackets at the bottom, or the empty square bracket at the bottom. And note, just this function passed to use effect cannot be asynchronous. So we must define an async function inside use effect and then call it on the inside. It is tempting to want to put like use effect async up there, but that's unfortunately not allowed. So what we have to do is we have to define our function get ingredients, make that an asynchronous function inside of our use effect, and then we call that on line 9 through get ingredients.
How to define get ingredients outside of use effect as a constant function, and then just call it use effect?
Yeah, that would also work. You could define that function outside of use effect and just call it.
So use effect, we get ingredients, column press square brackets.
Yeah. So the lines 9 and 10 would be the same, and you just take lines 4 through 8 and just shove it outside of use effect.
Sweet. So we should be good to move on to the demo today. This should be a slightly longer demo, but hopefully it'll be helpful. We're going to start off by going over the use state hooks, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail and do the use effect hook as well and combine the two. So for this one, we do have some starter code, just a basic React app. And whenever, right now it just says hello world. Just kind of created this a few minutes ago. So nothing fancy going on behind the scenes. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually have our state. So we're going to want a state variable. And remember, we're going to have to put that inside of our function and before our return. So we can do something like let number set number is equal to use state, and then the data type we want inside of it. We'll do a number. And I guess I should talk about what this code is going to be doing as well. It's just going to be that example we saw where changing or clicking a button kind of updates the or re-renders the page. And right now, if we try to run this, we're probably going to get an error saying we don't know what use state is. So we're going to want to define that as well. And we can do that by actually importing it from React and use state here. Bam. But right now, this still isn't going to do anything. We aren't like using state anywhere. So we'll create a button that when clicked will update the state. On click equals, we'll say add one. It'll just be a pretty simple example, and then click me. And then we'll actually go ahead and display the number as well. It's probably saying that add one isn't defined yet, but we'll just display the number. Say something like I've been clicked blank times. So now what we want to do is actually add that add number function. We can do that. Add one is equal to. And then again, this is where we're going to need to make use of that state or the setter variable. So we can just do something like set number and then number plus one. And here, add one is not defined. That call it wrong.
I'm not sure why is that an arrow function?
This one?
Yeah.
Oh.
Inside of set number.
Oh, sweet. So now every time we click the button, it'll just be updated. I'm seeing all of the missed typos now, but that happens. And so here we kind of set the state, and every time we click the button, we have a function that gets called. We can actually do this in our code as well. This is probably what I meant to do by having the arrow function. We can actually call it here as well, and we can just have our setter be right here. We don't even need a function to do so. And so if we get rid of the function now, we can just do it all in our code, and it should work as expected. If you refresh, the state's going to change, but we can go back to it as well. So that was the first part of our demo. It wasn't anything too exciting, but now we're going to go into something that's a little bit more complex, and that's actually going to be the use effect hook. I know we're going to need it now, so I might as well go ahead and import it. And then we'll also just have kind of the functions boilerplate code off the start, and then we can move on from there. So we don't know what this function is doing. I'll talk about that in a sec, but we'll talk about we're going to want it to render only when the page is first loaded. So what are we going to want our use effect to do? If we remember where we left off from our last demo on MongoDB, we had a few people in a database called demo. We had Paul Miller and me, and just the first name, last name, and age. We're gonna just want to load this information into our React application whenever our page loads through the use effect hook. So if we go back to our code, we can actually see the backend code for this as well. Nothing too fancy, just set up the schema for it. And then I guess we're going to call this route. So http:/localhost 3001. And then if we ever add API/people, we're basically going to get all the people. So we're in our use effect hook, we're actually going to fetch this route. And that's kind of going to be what we're doing. And then we're going to display all of that information on the screen. So if we go back to our demo, we can actually go ahead and start working inside of our use effect hook. Remember, we're gonna have to have a function, and then we're gonna have to call that function. So we can call it something like const load people, and we'll just have another arrow function. And then we're gonna actually want to call load people. As James mentioned, we could put this code technically outside of here, but we'll leave it in here for now. And yeah, and then, so that's gonna be kind of the basic boilerplate for our stuff. And then we can actually, I guess we were gonna want to check that it's working, so we can actually go ahead and console.log it eventually. We don't know what that's gonna be. So now we can go ahead and make our fetch request. We can do fetch, then our URL. Hopefully this is familiar. 3001 API people. I believe that was the route that was put here, API people. So now by going this route, we're gonna get, I can actually show you the Postman request for it as well. It just is the get all people. And it's just going to return, again, the list of first name, last name, age of everybody in our database. So that's kind of the information we're going to be getting once we run our fetch request. So again, this has to be asynchronous. I personally think that using then as opposed to async await is a little bit cleaner for fetch requests and kind of only fetch requests. So I'll do a fetch request example for this, but you guys are all free to use async await in your actual code. So what this first dot then is doing is taking the result returned from that fetch request, and it's kind of putting that into JSON. And then we can do something like set another JSON data, and we can actually, this is going to be where we're going to use the, shoot, totally forgot something. We're going to want to store these people in an array. So we'll do let people and then set people. And that's going to be another state variable. And this is going to be an array. So we can just leave it empty for now. It would be null, but we don't want to define an empty array because that could actually cause some issues if we tried to return, if we tried to get people from our database and nothing was returned, it would actually return an empty array as well. And so that by leaving it as null, we can kind of like see that we haven't, that's like kind of our expected result. It's never going to be null, but it can be an empty array. So by leaving it empty, we're just kind of setting it like so. And then we can actually go ahead and do our setter function in here. We can do set people. I think I always do this arrow function thing, and I'm not sure why I do it. I don't think it's necessary, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why I do that. That might be a bad habit. So I think I can get rid of that. Then this, and if I believe this should work. So now if we open up our console and see what happens whenever we refresh our page, because as remembered, that's what's going to happen whenever we click or whenever we leave the square brackets empty. So if we refresh, oh, I didn't log people. Refresh, we should see, I saw it for a second. Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted to happen. So we're going to see that it's undefined. And why that is, why it's undefined is because, again, this needs to be an asynchronous function. What I want to happen is it should work sometimes and it shouldn't work other times at its current state. I think it's just going to not work. Maybe the internet here is too slow or something. I don't know. But I was hoping to show that this can be a tricky error to debug because sometimes it will return data depending on, I guess, kind of your computer's performance and the internet speeds and a few other things. So I guess this is just kind of bad. We can't really use, if we look at like the order of the code ran, load people is going to run. And then while this is running, our code's going to try to get and log the people. Sometimes this will happen, I guess, before, sometimes we'll try to log the people before this is finished. And other times, sometimes this could run before this finishes. So we're not actually going to log the people. We'll log it in our code in a little bit. But what we're just going to kind of output the people. So initially, we're just going to make a map. And I'm actually going to explain one more feature here, and that's going to be conditional function. So what we want to happen is if there's people returned, we're going to want our code to display those people. And if not, we can display something like loading or no people returned or something like that. And so I'm going to kind of show some shorthand syntax for creating, I guess, conditional rendering. So if we look, what this is going to be doing is it's checking for people. So if there's people, I guess if people returns null, it's going to run this code. And if people returns not null, it'll run the code in between this brackets. I guess for now, we can just do p loading here. And we can do, let's see, for now, we can just do another hi or something and just see what happens. So if we have no value for our people, we'll see, you see briefly, it goes from loading to hi. And so what that is doing is whenever this code is running, it'll display loading because people hasn't been set yet by this variable or by this setter. And then once it gets set, it actually updates people and then it forces a re-render. And then this code changes from going to display loading to hi. So again, just one more time, we could actually, if we put our console.log in here, it should work. I think there's an issue with code inside of JS directly inside of JS. So if we put it here or something, it's not a great place for it, but now it should always return values in our console. I'll zoom in a little bit more and we can actually see that now we have access to these values that we created. So we have our first element, Paul Miller, and then we have our second element, me. And now we can actually use this information if we want to. So we can have a kind of like a map like we've done before. We can just do something like people.map. Then each person. And then we can just do like a P for person.name dot first. And now each person should be displayed here. Again, this isn't like the most useful example, but hopefully you can kind of see how this could be applied into our actual milestone. We can see in our own milestone, we're probably going to want to load in the recipes data. And then once that recipes data is going to be loaded in, that's kind of when, or that's how we'll use this in our own project. And then once we work on the actual project milestones, all of your data is going to be stored in a database somewhere. And you're going to have to kind of wait for that data to be returned before you can access it. Is there any questions about what was just covered in the demo? The use state hook, hopefully that's starting to make a little bit sense. The use effect hook, I think conceptually it's a little bit harder to understand, but using it, like getting your own practice and hands-on experience with it, it should start to make sense pretty easily. But yeah, that should be it for this demo. Let's move back to the slides.
And just as a reminder that like question mark colon syntax that Cole wrote for the conditional rendering, that's like the same syntax that we covered way back in like the intro to JavaScript, where it's basically like an abbreviated if statement. So if people map, otherwise loading.
I think we can even show that a little bit better. I forgot, it's like people equals null. That's just kind of going to be the condition. You put the condition at the front, and then by having this is kind of just shorthand for then.
Yeah, that also goes back to null is an example of a false C value. So JavaScript sees null and just converts it to false.
So now we're good to move on to React Router. If you haven't seen, or if you're not too far along the milestone, it is used in Milestone 3, which is actually kind of before we taught it. It is an NPM package, so it's going to be something we have to download before we use in our project. I think the command's npm I react-router. And I'll also add too, React Router very recently updated to version 6 as opposed to version 5. For this demo, I'm gonna, or not demo, for this like slides, I guess, I'll be talking about the most recent version, so version 6, although probably the majority of the documentation you'll see out there is going to be version 5. And we can also kind of see the power in NPM as well here, because they are updating their packages and keeping all these things helpful, and they're updating their code that we can just use easier. So big up NPM and big up React Router. And why do we actually need to use React Router in our website? It's because React is a single page application. That's kind of why we can't use A tags to navigate from here to there like we could with HTML, is because React is all just one single page. And yeah, so when you run npm start, app is always rendered. And so components aren't complete HTML pages as we've seen. So we can't just change components like through our anchor tags in the same way we did in HTML. So instead, we're using that node package React Router. And we're going to be going over the syntax for, again, the most recent version, which was just released at the beginning of this month. So React Router has a few main kind of features to it. Inside your app.js, you're going to want to have routes. And this is going to emulate like your actual URL, and like navigating between URLs is you're going to have a bunch of different routes in your app.js. We'll get into this more in the example that's on the following page, but just be kind of familiar that the path is going to be the URL that gets added to the current URL. So if we are at localhost 3001, and then we went to /about, the about element would be rendered, and that's actually going to be the about component that gets rendered when we go to about page. So yeah, just the element shows that that's the component that should be displayed at that route. So here's kind of a more full example. We can see the browser router is kind of going to wrap all of our routes. And so that should be the outermost tag that exists, honestly, in our whole app, inside of our app.js file. We import browser router directly from React Router. So that's going to be in our import state, and we can use it like that. And then we'll see the nav bar. By not putting it in the routes, it's going to be rendered on every page regardless of what URL we're at. And that's just kind of the way, and the beauty of components is we can do things like that a lot easier. And then we actually go into our routes. Again, the first one, if there's no additional URL like text added behind localhost 3000 element, it's just gonna render the home page. If we navigate to about, it's gonna move to the about component, and then we can actually indicate URL parameters as well in with React Router. And this is kind of a little bit more complex, and we should get into an example in it in a minute. But if we go to like recipe / pasta primavera, it'll render rest of the recipe component, or any other valid name for a recipe is going to know to render that component. And then since React Router is different from traditional HTML navigation, we no longer need to use those anchor tags to navigate in our site. And not just we no longer use them, we can't use them. If we try to use them, we will get errors. And so instead of that, React Router has a link tag, and it kind of does the same thing as an A tag. You just change the A's to links, and you change the href to 2. But besides that, it should behave the same way as an anchor tag. Again, you're going to want to import link at the top of your page. If you use an IDE, it should do that for you, but that is a note as well to add. So as mentioned, there are a little bit more tricky examples, like whenever we want to route to a specific URL. So if we want to route to pesto like cavatappi or pasta primavera, or anything that comes after recipe that is a valid recipe, we can put the colon to like tell the URL that that's going to be a URL parameter. And that's kind of how we communicate data across pages is through the URL. So I don't know if you guys have ever like been on a website and there's like a URL that's like thousands of characters long or just a really long one. That's not the best way to do it, but it is and the kind of more outdated way to do that. But where this really works is for smaller things like just one variable. So like recipe name, if that's all we need, it works well to put it in the as a URL parameter. Otherwise, we're going to want to pass information in through the body. And so the route, what it's going to do is it's going to match any word after the colon. So like recipe / pasta or recipe / anything else. And then we can actually get the URL in the parameter component with the use param hook. So inside of the recipe component, we can do the thing where we say let param equals use params. And then if we go ahead and log that, we have access to that, I guess, in all of our, in our recipe component. And if we can see, use param is another hook. It's used a little bit less. It's only kind of used in this case, but I guess tying the two together, hooks are seen everywhere, I guess. The most common two ones are the use effect one and the use state hook, but there's so many out there, more than we could cover, but you'll kind of need to figure those out on a case-by-case basis. Some other common ones are use param, use history, use memoization. We'll make sure to have links to additional resources in the Notion page as well. I guess, is there any questions about React Router at this moment? Sweet. So now we're actually going to wrap up. We do have some pretty big announcements about the milestone. But first, there's some other useful React resources and packages. You want to talk about these, Vance?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff we weren't able to cover, but in general, NPM is your friend. So one of the more tricky things, as you can kind of see in that one slide, is that forms in React behave differently and they're just syntactically more trickier to deal with. So there's a couple of great NPM packages we'd highly recommend, like React Hook Form or Formic, especially when you start working on like a volunteer management system. Volunteers have to fill out a lot of forms. So we'd highly recommend using one of those on a project. Also, if you do, and we're going to make like this part of the milestone optional, but if you want to like add a form to make add a whole new recipe to your website, this would also be very handy to use. Additionally, as we have lots and lots of data, there's going to be this, it's going to be nice to have this thing called global state, which basically allows you to kind of access data that you fetched one time anywhere in your program, so you don't have to pass it all through 50 props. A couple of great options for that. React Redux is really good, also kind of hard to learn, but would really recommend learning it. You'll probably end up using it on your project team. React Context is also really good, and that's built directly into React, so you don't even need to download that. And then Recoil, I've never used, but that's also supposed to be good. And then a couple other tools, React Developer Tools. This is like a browser extension, so if you know inspect element, this is inspect element for React. So if you're debugging props or you're debugging state, would highly recommend getting this on your browser. It's really easy and just makes debugging a lot easier on the front end. React docs are great. To warn you, they are written in class components. So if you ever are reading it and get confused, I'd recommend going back to earlier parts of the documentation just to make sure you understand how class components are structured. But I'd highly recommend them. And then React prop types. This is more like a code quality thing, but if you want to have JavaScript is like an untyped language, but if you want to have your props that you pass into a component detyped, we highly recommend using React prop types. And that's also a node package. Any questions about any of those resources? React Developer Tools is the big one though, everyone should get that.
I'll actually go ahead and show that right now.
Yeah.
If I can figure out how to close this damn
It
thing.
should be available on any browser.
Yeah,
I know it's
so
on Chrome. Firefox. I'd assume it's on Safari.
If we go ahead and go to it, inspect, and we do have the, I guess what is it called? The React Dev Tools installed. We'll see these two other things, which might be kind of hard to see, but you have your components and profile. It's probably not going to look like all that helpful right now because this is such a small example, but we only have the app component, so it doesn't look like much. But if there was more components here, you'd be able to see like their structure and how they're nested. So sometimes when you have a lot of trees.
You can see like the state inside the DevTools there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just like a kind of helpful way to debug a lot of your React code. And then I believe there's also, where'd I go? Profiler. That's just kind of again, a more advanced way to actually debug your code. I don't think I've actually ever used it, but I've heard good things about it as well. It just works kind of like the debugger does in the inspect element console, but just for React. And then this is kind of where the big announcements are, is the last two milestones. Now that Bootcamp's over, there's not going to be any more content that we haven't seen on any of the projects. The Milestone 4, it's going to be a lot shorter than Milestone 3 was. The React one is really probably the biggest for people, especially for people who haven't seen React before. It's the biggest and most complex of all the milestones. So Milestone 4 should hopefully be a little bit of breathing room for those of you who are still finishing it up. What that one is going to be is it's just going to be creating some routes. So it's just going to be basically setting up your MongoDB account, setting up your backend for your project, and then it's actually going to be creating those routes as well. Well, I guess we can go into the Notion pages a little bit after this, but Milestone 4 is due November 28th. So that's going to be, I think, the end of Thanksgiving break. The other option was either have it due at the end of this week. So although we don't feel good about it being due like on your final day of break, it just gives you a little bit more time to finish it up. And then Milestone 5 is actually the final demo. And what that's going to be is it's going to take the routes from Milestone 4 and actually put that into our code on the front end through the use effect hook and state hooks we've seen. So again, that's going to be a slightly shorter milestone. But as we can see, the due date is going to be December 20th. That's quite a bit of ways, and we don't encourage anybody to wait that long. But we get that the Bootcamp project is kind of a lot of work. People who have busier quarters, it can be harder to keep up with this. So by making it all the way to December 20th, quite a bit into break, hopefully you guys will be able to find some more time to actually like complete the demos. And this is actually a hard deadline. So before you can be put on a project team, you do have to complete the 5 milestones. And yeah, but this, just because it's not due until December 20th does not mean that you should wait till December 20th to finish them all up. That's a bad idea, and it's just don't do that. That's all I recommend. Plus, we're going to continue holding some office hours until then. So we're going to be doing it Sundays, 11 to noon, basically, until the day before the final project's due. If you guys are stuck at all during any of the breaks, that's probably the best time to get help, or also just reach out to us on Slack or schedule office hours. It doesn't really matter. Whatever works for you works for us. And then, wait, did I skip a slide?
No, that's the next slide.
Okay. We're going to be holding a project development / final study social. And that's just kind of going to be, I don't want to say office hours because it's not. It's just going to be time for you to all like combine, work together if you're still working on your project, and kind of have everybody there kind of to help you whenever you need it. It's just going to be on the second floor of the library behind Julian's coffee shops. That's whenever you go up the stairs. I think we're going to reserve a fishbowl. So actually this location might be a little bit different. But if you've already finished with the project or don't want to work on it, well, the rest of us are going to be studying for finals. I think it's going to be a whole club social, not just the developers. So keep that in mind. And yeah, reminders. This is your last in-person bootcamp session. Like, it's a lot of freaking work. I get that coming to freaking 2 like hour-long sessions twice a week on the top of your classes is actually pretty strenuous. So hopefully you found it very like a good way to learn a lot of things. Hopefully you found parts of it enjoyable as well. In my own experience, these are the materials that I wish were taught in your actual classes that aren't taught. I've seen a lot of the stuff covered in bootcamp in industry, and I think you guys will probably see that as well. But yeah. Oh yeah, the Chipotle fundraiser. That's going to be this Tuesday, November 16th from 5 to 9. There's a flyer in Slack, and there's a lot more information about it on Slack as well. But if you show them the flyer, we get a share of the profits for ordering things like shirts. I believe everybody's going to get a shirt. I think it's going to be it's either going to be shipped to you over winter break, or it'll be right after winter break ends. We'll be able to all get shirts. So this is kind of the Chipotle fundraiser is going to help fund that. Yeah, so I think there's going to be rides organized. If you have a car, bring yourself, bring friends. Hope to see you guys all there. And yeah, am I missing anything?
Yeah, thanks for coming. Y'all did great. This is a lot of work. So nice job showing up and putting in the effort.
Nice. Oh yeah.